Hello. Today I'm going to look at early medieval religious thought, the second chapter in B.B. Price's Medieval Thought, an introduction. This particular chapter consists of 3 sections. We'll talk about the first today, the growth of intellectual Christianity, and then the other 2 next week, the rise of doctrinal issues and the posture to the past. As in the previous chapter, I've added the phrase "in the West" in several places, as Price doesn't always make it clear that particular developments were not universal, but were confined to the Western Roman Christians and not followed by those in the East. So, the growth of intellectual Christianity. Historical periods are not isolated from each other. The European Middle Ages were rooted in late antiquity, and there are obvious continuities from the intellectualizing of the classical and late Roman periods and that of the Middle Ages. Early Christian thought developed in the process of Christianity's initial intellectualization. A variety of ideas and practices developed during Christianity's early spread, and these were gradually subject to rationalized interpretation. In the 4th century, Christian leaders had already removed non-Christian practices and what were seen as abuses, but this was no longer enough to keep the reins on a widely extended community. Theologizing had already led to many difficult differences in exegesis, clerical responsibility, and doctrine. Older surveys of the Middle Ages tend to focus only on the later centuries in terms of intellectual activity. This is partly due to the liking certain scholars have for the intellectual expressions which began in the 12th century. But in fact, there was already a significant increase in Christian intellectual activity in earlier periods. Documents reveal that both before and after the Roman adoption of Christianity in the 4th century, a major intellectual transformation of Christianity was underway in both East and West. This impacted almost every aspect of the religion. The most structured element in this intellectualization were the church councils. Attended by leading Christians, the councils increased in number over time, with only a few exceptional gaps. They functioned as debating sessions where, in principle, decisions could be reached on issues relating to all Christians through a process of consensus building. Topics included the role of revelation, religious creeds, and modes of scriptural exegesis. The fact that these councils were called reflected a concern with authority and interpretation. The early Christians intellectualized most of their rituals and beliefs, hitherto lacking abstract formulation. By coming under the control of the institutional church, the intellectualizing process seems to have been largely restricted to the upper hierarchy. Certainly the clergy determined the interpretation of doctrine without reference to the reflections of the laity. In the western part of the empire in particular, an intellectual elite of clerics was rising, and this group periodically became disassociated from the needs of the laity. The idea of the church as an institution was embodied both in the clerical hierarchy and in the West, the papacy. A hierarchical clerical structure was not based on Jesus' teaching or on the practices of the early church, but by the early 2nd century, most of institutionalized Christianity was connected to an organizational theory centered on bishops. For the laity, it was preferable to have a permanent local pastor than the inspiration of an itinerant teacher. Studies have linked the rise of the clergy to contemporary Palestinian and Hellenistic Jewish synagogues, but articulate Christians of the time thought that its roots lay in the succession of certain individuals to the apostles who had received the charisma of truth. The early laity seemed to have held charismatics in high regard as prophets, apostles, and teachers, but as the celebration of Christian rituals, such as baptism, liturgical worship, the Eucharist, and so on, became the exclusive privilege of specific ordained individuals, they established a definite supremacy over the charismatics. All Christian communities came to be led by a specific ordained church official. including bishops, presbyters, and deacons. Further hierarchical ordering gave the highest distinction to bishops. In the West, there was a second transformation, from rule by a collectivity of bishops to the theory of papal supremacy. This was initially confined to educated and ruling groups in Rome who valued their bishop for his local political and religious status. The earliest assertion of what became a vigorous campaign for justification by successive bishops of Rome culminated in the 5th century interpretation by Pope Leo I of what by then was a fully developed theory based on 2 passages in the New Testament. The first from Matthew 16, "And I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And then from John 21, "He saith unto him the 3rd time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Peter was grieved because he said unto him the 3rd time, Lovest thou me? And he said unto him, Lord, thou knowest all things, thou knowest that I love thee. Jesus saith unto him, Feed my sheep." For Leo, the popes, the paternal bishops in Rome, were the spiritual heirs and successors to the Apostle Peter, the first bishop of Rome, and the rock on which Jesus had chosen to build his church, and to whom he had entrusted his keys. Some later medieval thinkers found this theory doubtful, including the famous William of Ockham. Nor were other churches at the time convinced of these claims to Petrine and papal supremacy. This was the first significant wedge between Eastern and Western Roman Christians. By the 4th century, the growing entrenchment of the clerical hierarchy is indicated by the formulation of guidelines and rules of clerical responsibility, ideas that are repeated in the Middle Ages, along with comments on the misuse of clerical authority and office. There are early signs of this concern in the canons from the Council of Nicaea in 325 and Sardica, modern Sofia, in 342-43. Thus, there is concern that there is insufficient spiritual preparation and dedication amongst the clergy, that there is manifest greed and ambition for higher offices, and there's the problem of celibacy. Of bishops, it was said, all are aflame with the fires of greed and slaves of ambition. That's from Sardica. So apologists by this time were developing a mythology of the divinely determined role of Christianity. The Church was being seen as the divinely chosen successor of Imperial Rome. Its members were serving God's plan. This blossomed in the writings of Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, particularly his The City of God, in the early 5th century, responding to Roman accusations that the barbarian invasions were a punishment for the neglect of the old gods by the Christians. As Rome fell, the Church was taking its place, modelled on it and reflecting its universal and orderly identity. Christian religious leaders filled the void, becoming highly valued as administrators, judges, and defenders of Christian interests and the new society, especially for the devout laity. Once seen as a corpus of simple truths expounded by word and deed, Christianity moved towards intellectualization, and as it did so suffered the same confusions and ambiguities of any philosophy. A simple religion based on experience and a few rituals was transformed into an abstract theology. There was a growing fervor for such a development amongst the elite. The growing importance of institutionalized Christianity in administration had already led to a growing rift between popular belief and intellectualized Christianity. This was accentuated by increasing intellectualization, already well underway by the start of the Middle Ages. The laity's sense of having a role in and understanding of institutionalized Christianity was firmly reduced. The Church insisted on official belief and practice in order to organize smoothly, but there were problems in this process after the 2nd century and a lack of consensus. Christians disagreed about what the proper rituals and newly asserted theological underpinnings were. Later, in the Middle Ages, these disagreements were to lead to some people being branded as heretics. There was also an attempt to untangle popular beliefs and rituals, and the Church sporadically integrated popular beliefs into its structure, but a Christianized folklore and superstition continued to thrive separately from intellectualized religion. So many thanks for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons. You're welcome to support my channel. Please do like, comment, and share if you will. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and if you want to support the channel practically, you can do so through Patreon and PayPal, links below. Next week, we'll talk about the rise of doctrinal issues. Have a good day.